A man forced his son to marry a cleaner to punish him. What the couple did next left him in shock. John Edwards had never cared about the consequences. At just 25, he was used to living in a world where everything belonged to him, and nothing was out of reach. Money, power, and a last name that opened doors where others only found barriers. But that night would be different. Everything he had taken for granted would start to crumble. The party he had organized for his birthday was the most extravagant the city had seen in a long time. John had rented the most exclusive event hall, decorated with neon lights and carnival-like decorations, featuring international DJs, gourmet food, and a parade of the city's most influential personalities. Around him gathered models, actors, and businessmen, all laughing loudly and raising their glasses to toast his generosity. John was in his element, the center of attention, surrounded by a circle of friends who praised him endlessly. Dressed in a tailored black suit and holding a glass of champagne, he made sarcastic comments and jokes while his friends cheered with shouts of excitement. It was a night where decadence was the order of the day, and John was the undisputed king of this kingdom of excess. "John, this party is insane," exclaimed one of his friends, slightly staggering from all the drinks he had consumed. "No one throws parties like you. How much did all this cost you?" John smirked arrogantly and shrugged, pretending to be indifferent. "It's just money. Next time it'll be bigger. If my dear father allows it," he added, with a hint of sarcasm that went unnoticed among the crowd. "You're the heir to all this, man," said another friend, slapping him hard on the back. "Who could stop you?" John looked around. Everyone admired him, but he knew it wasn't for who he was, but for what he represented. Unlimited access to a life of luxury and favors. But behind that carefree smile hid a truth he would never admit out loud. His father, Henry Edwards, had never allowed him to be truly free. John was nothing more than an extension of his father's reputation, a pawn in his power games. That night, anger and frustration simmered beneath the surface, and as the glasses kept filling and the laughter grew louder, John decided he needed something more, something that would make him feel, at least for a moment, that he was in control. "I'm going for a ride," he suddenly announced, standing up from the leather couch where he was surrounded by his followers. "What?" asked a friend, looking surprised as John pulled out the keys to his sports car. "Are you going to drive like this?" "I don't think that's a good idea, John. You're, well, you know." "Drunk?" John laughed. "Relax, I'm an Edwards. What could go wrong?" And without waiting for a response, he walked out of the hall with determined steps. The cold night air hit his face as he opened the main door and descended the marble steps to the parking lot. There, waiting for him, was his latest acquisition, a gleaming red Ferrari, a whim he had decided to buy without even thinking twice. With his pulse racing and a reckless gleam in his eyes, he slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The roar of the engine filled the air, and without a second thought, he slammed the accelerator. The car shot out of the parking lot, leaving behind the echoes of laughter and the lights of the party. The city stretched out before him like a game board. The streets were almost deserted at that hour of the morning, and John sped through them, ignoring traffic lights and road signs. The Ferrari's headlights cut through the darkness like a knife, illuminating buildings and closed shops. John felt a surge of euphoria, as if for the first time in a long while, he could break free from the invisible chains that bound him. The speedometer climbed higher and higher, and the urban landscape became a blur around him. But then, at an intersection, he took a turn too fast. The car skidded, and before he could regain control, it crashed violently into a historic monument in the center of the square. The sound of the impact was deafening, metal against stone, glass shattering, and the Ferrari crumpling under the force of the blow. John felt a sharp pain in his chest as the airbag deployed and pushed him back. His breath was knocked out, and for a moment, everything blurred. When he opened his eyes, still dazed, he saw the red and blue lights of police cars and ambulances rushing toward him. The paramedics arrived quickly, gently but urgently pulling him out of the car. Camera flashes began to explode around him as reporters and onlookers crowded near the accident. John blinked, trying to clear his vision, but all he could see were anonymous faces and looks of disapproval. "It's John Edwards," someone shouted. "The son of the magnate Henry Edwards. Look what he's done." The cameras captured every detail: his disoriented face, the wreckage of the car, and the shattered statue. It was a spectacle worthy of the front page of every newspaper in the country. Within minutes, news of the scandal had spread like wildfire. As John was being taken to the ambulance, a reporter's camera zoomed in on his face, capturing his expression of fear and confusion. The images started broadcasting live, and within seconds, the Edwards family became the target of all criticism and speculation. The scene shifted suddenly. In the darkness of his mansion, Henry Edwards watched the TV screen with a frown and eyes filled with fury. He saw his son's face, the young man he had pampered and protected for years, now at the center of a shameful scandal that threatened to destroy the reputation he had worked so hard to build. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. The phone wouldn't stop ringing, and Henry ignored it. Only one thought dominated his mind. It was time to act. John had crossed the line, and it was time for him to learn a lesson he would never forget. With a sudden decision, he rose from his chair and dialed a number on his phone. "Call Elena Rodriguez," he ordered firmly. "Tell her I need her in my office first thing tomorrow morning." He hung up and stared at the screen in silence. His son would pay dearly for this mistake, and Elena Rodriguez, the humble cleaner at his company, would be the key piece for John to finally understand what true humiliation meant. The morning after the accident, Henry Edwards's office was filled with tension. Sunlight barely filtered through the closed curtains, and the atmosphere was almost somber. Henry, dressed in an impeccable grey suit, sat behind his massive dark wood desk, drumming his fingers impatiently. In front of him, his computer screen displayed explosive headlines. "Magnate's son tarnishes the Edwards name. Another scandal. What will Henry Edwards do?" Henry's face was a mask of severity. The worry lines on his forehead were more pronounced than usual. He was used to dealing with business crises, but this was a personal attack. It wasn't just his business at stake. It was his name, his legacy. The silence was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Come in," he said with an authoritative tone. The door opened slowly, and Elena Rodriguez timidly stepped into the room. She wore her work uniform, dark pants and a simple white shirt. Her hands, calloused from years of manual labor, were clasped in front of her, and her eyes reflected uncertainty. She knew a call from Henry Edwards was no trivial matter. No one in her position had ever been summoned to the office of the company's owner himself. "Mr. Edwards," she greeted with a slight bow of her head, keeping her gaze down out of respect. Henry watched her intently, assessing her. To his eyes, Elena was the perfect archetype of humility and integrity. She had no power, no status, no privileges, but she had something he desperately needed, a dignity that John had never known. "Miss Rodriguez, please sit down," he gestured to the chair in front of his desk. Elena hesitated for a moment, then nervously took a seat. Her heart was racing, but her face remained calm. She didn't understand why she was there, but something in Henry's gaze told her this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. "Do you know why I called you?" Henry asked, his voice as cold as steel. "No, Mr. Edwards, but I'm here to listen to whatever you have to say." Henry nodded slowly, pleased with her response. She was respectful and direct, qualities he valued, especially in people with few chances to speak face-to-face with someone of his position. "My son John has made another unforgivable mistake," he began, enunciating each word with deliberate calm. "He has brought our family's name to the brink of ruin. I can no longer allow him to keep destroying everything I've built." Elena looked at him cautiously, not knowing what to say. Of course, she had heard about John and his reckless behavior. All the employees knew him as the company's spoiled brat, the troublesome heir who always managed to escape the consequences. I have made a decision that under normal circumstances I would never have considered. I need you to marry my son, Henry finally said, dropping the words as if delivering a verdict. Elena froze. She hadn't understood what she'd just heard. The silence became thick, laden with disbelief. "Excuse me?" she whispered, barely audible. Henry leaned forward, his cold eyes fixed on hers. "You heard me right, Miss Rodriguez. I want you to marry John. Not because I think he's suitable for you, nor because I believe it will be a happy marriage. I want him to feel the humiliation, the sacrifice, and the effort that you represent. You will be his punishment." Elena felt as if the ground opened up beneath her feet. Henry's words hit her like a storm. Marry John Edwards. It was absurd, unthinkable. But the way Henry spoke made it clear this wasn't just a suggestion. He was serious. "Mr. Edwards, This is," Elena stammered, struggling to find the words. "I can't accept something like this. It makes no sense." Henry interrupted her with an impatient gesture. "I know it seems crazy, Ms. Rodriguez, but listen to me carefully. Your mother is very sick, isn't she?" Elena nodded slowly, confused. "I can make sure she gets the best treatment available, at no cost. All you have to do is agree." Elena felt her world start to spin. Henry was exploiting her weaknesses, using her greatest fear, losing her mother. "This isn't fair," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Why me?" Henry leaned back in his chair, intertwining his fingers. When he spoke again, his tone was almost gentle. "Because you are everything John despises, and everything he needs to learn to appreciate. You work hard, you don't complain. You have sacrificed your life to take care of someone you love. John has never done anything like that. I want him to feel what it's like to not have everything handed to him and to have to fight for every little success." Elena looked down, feeling a mix of anger and despair. Henry was using her as a tool, as a pawn in his struggle to reform his son. But her mother. The image of her mother lying in the hospital bed, struggling to breathe, flashed vividly in her mind. "If I marry your son," she said, lifting her gaze with determination, "will you really make sure my mother receives the treatment? Is this not just an empty promise?" Henry's smile was faint, devoid of kindness. "I am a man of my word, Ms. Rodriguez. If you agree, your mother will have the best treatment available. But you must decide now. There will be no second chances." Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't want to do it. Marrying someone like John, a man who would treat her with contempt, who would have no respect for her, it was like selling her soul. But if it meant saving her mother, how could she refuse? "All right," she finally said, her voice firm even though her hands trembled. "I accept." Henry nodded slowly, as if he had known all along what her answer would be. "Perfect. The wedding will be in 3 days. And remember, Elena, you are not the one being punished. My son is. But it won't be easy. He will make you suffer. Be prepared." Elena left the office feeling as if she had just signed her own sentence, but she did it with her head held high, determined not to let John break her. She did this for her mother, for the only person she had left in the world. And Henry, watching her leave, knew he had found the perfect woman for his plan. Elena was waiting in the small meeting room when John walked in, his face hardened and his hands stuffed in the pockets of his expensive black coat. The room was bare, with plain white walls and only a glass table with a couple of chairs in front of it. Elena stood up, nervous, when the door slammed shut behind him. John looked at her with disdain. There was no effort to hide his disgust as he looked her up and down, as if she were an intruder in his perfect world. Despite having heard the news of his impending marriage just hours earlier, he hadn't wanted to believe it. This all seemed like a sick joke, a cruel strategy by his father to humiliate him. But when he walked into that room and saw the woman destined to be his wife, rage filled him. "You're the cleaner, right?" he said coldly, crossing his arms. Elena raised her gaze, trying to control the trembling in her hands. She knew this moment would come, that she would have to face him head-on, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of his gaze, full of disdain and hatred. "Yes, I am Elena Rodriguez," she replied, her voice steady though soft. She didn't want to appear weak, not in front of him. John laughed sarcastically, a dry, joyless laugh that echoed in the empty room. "What did my father promise you? Money? A house? Or do you just like the idea of marrying someone like me?" he spat, taking a step closer to her. He looked at her with a mix of resentment and mockery. "What do you hope to gain from this?" Elena pressed her lips together, struggling to stay calm. She didn't want him to see her waver, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much his words hurt. She took a deep breath and held his gaze firmly. "Your father offered to pay for my mother's medical treatment," she replied, looking him straight in the eye. "That's all. I'm not interested in your money or your last name, John. And if it were up to me, I would never have accepted this madness." John leaned in close, so near that Elena could smell the expensive cologne he wore, but also the faint scent of alcohol still lingering on his breath from the night before. "Then why are you doing it?" he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "If you really don't care about my money, why agree to such a humiliating deal?" "Because I have no other choice," she answered coldly. "My mother is all I have, and if marrying you is what it takes to save her, then I will do it." John stared at her for a long moment, searching for any sign of deceit in her words, but he found none, only determination. A determination that infuriated him even more because he knew his father was winning. He knew he was losing control. "Very noble," he murmured sarcastically, straightening up and stepping back. "But let me make one thing clear from the start. This is just a game for my father, a ridiculous punishment for me, and you're nothing but a pawn. When this ends, and believe me, it will end soon, you'll be alone again, with your mother, without my help, without my name, and then what will you do?" Elena felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she didn't back down. She clenched her fists, her knuckles white from the strength with which she gripped them. "I'll do what I have to do," she replied in a low but firm voice. "I don't need anything from you. I'll just fulfill my part of the deal." John let out a disbelieving snort, as if he couldn't believe the audacity of the woman standing in front of him. For a moment, he wondered if he could really stand having her around. She was nothing like the women he was used to. She didn't smile flirtatiously or try to please him. She was different, and that made him even angrier. "Fine," he finally said, turning toward the door. "But if you think I'm going to treat you like my wife, you're sorely mistaken. You'll be my wife only on paper. I don't want to see you. I don't want to hear you. And if by some miracle you decide this isn't worth it and walk away, I won't be the one to stop you." With those words, he left the room, leaving her alone with the echo of his hatred reverberating off the walls. Elena sank into the chair, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The first confrontation had been even worse than she imagined. John was cold, ruthless, and above all, he despised her. It wasn't going to be easy. Despite Henry's warnings, she hadn't expected such hostility right from the start. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. If she was going to survive this marriage of convenience, she would have to be strong. For her mother. For herself. She couldn't let John break her so easily. No matter what he said or did, she would maintain her dignity. Her sacrifice would not be in vain. That same afternoon, news of the wedding spread like wildfire throughout the company. Rumors flew from mouth to mouth, each more scandalous than the last. Employees gathered in the hallways, whispering and casting sidelong glances at Elena as she passed by. "Did you hear?" whispered a secretary to her colleague as they crossed the reception area. "Henry Edwards's son is marrying a cleaner. It's insane." "There must be some catch," replied the other, shaking her head. "Why would someone like him do something like that?" The comments reached John's ears as he walked through the building, his expression hardening with each step. He was the center of attention, but not in the way he was used to. Now, he was the object of mockery and pity, and all because his father had decided to use him as a damned pawn in his game of morality. Determined to get away from the prying eyes and whispers, he left the building and headed to the parking lot. He needed to escape, even if just for a few hours. But as he approached his car, he found Elena again. She was standing near the entrance, her face expressionless, waiting for a taxi. He stopped, watching her in silence. For a moment, the hatred and disdain were eclipsed by another emotion, one he barely recognized: curiosity. Why would this woman accept such an absurd deal? What kept her standing firm when all he wanted was to see her break? But that feeling vanished as quickly as it had come, replaced by a burning resentment. He turned without saying anything and walked away, leaving her alone once more. Elena watched him leave, her heart pounding. John was a dangerous man, not just because of his power or position, but because of the hatred that seemed to consume him. If they were going to survive this marriage, it would be up to her to remain calm, because John clearly would do everything possible to break her. The day of the wedding arrived with an air of resignation and disdain. The sky was covered by a thick layer of grey clouds, as if even nature refused to bless a union so devoid of love. Instead of the opulence and splendor that usually accompanied the Edwards family's weddings, this marriage took place in a small municipal courthouse. There were no flowers adorning the columns, no laughter echoing in the halls. The atmosphere was austere and silent, with an air of uncomfortable formality. John arrived first, escorted by a couple of his father's assistants. He wore a simple black suit, devoid of the luxurious details he was used to. He walked with his hands in his pockets, his expression stony, his eyes dark and empty of emotion. He stopped in front of the courthouse doors and took a deep breath, struggling to contain the anger boiling inside his chest. How could my father do this to me? He thought over and over, unable to find a way out of this situation that seemed absurd and unreal. Marrying a cleaner, this is a farce, a damn circus. When he entered the small room where the ceremony would take place, a couple of employees turned to look at him. They had heard the rumors and knew this wedding was anything but a happy event. Whispers of disapproval and surprise filled the air as John took his place on the right side of the room, arms crossed and a scowl of annoyance on his lips. Then the door opened again and Elena entered. She wore a simple white dress, nothing more than a modest outfit borrowed from a co-worker. Her hair was tied back in a low bun and she wore barely any makeup. She had no bouquet, no jewelry, not even a smile on her face, but there was something in her upright posture and the way she walked that conveyed dignity. She walked with her head held high, despite the stares of the few people present, knowing that they were all there to judge her. John looked up and stared at her, narrowing his eyes in a mixture of mockery and disdain. She didn't seem terrified as he had imagined. On the contrary, her calm and unruffled expression threw him off, almost as if he were the one being scrutinized. Elena stopped beside him, looking at the judge presiding over the ceremony. The silence was so oppressive she could almost hear her own breathing. The room was small and cold, with grey walls and worn marble floors. The judge, an older man with glasses and a tired expression, leafed through the documents in front of him without looking up. "We are gathered here to unite John Henry Edwards and Elena Rodriguez in marriage," he began in a monotone voice. "Are both parties in agreement to marry according to the terms of this contract?" John felt his throat go dry and his blood boil under his skin. He wanted to shout no, that this was a mistake, that he shouldn't be there. But when he looked up, he saw his father at the back of the room. Henry watched everything with a stern expression, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes glimmered with a warning that needed no words. "If you say no," You'll lose everything, they seemed to say. This is your punishment, John. Accept it or disappear. Elena noticed the tension in his jaw and the fury in his eyes. She wanted to turn around and run. What was she doing here? This wasn't a wedding. It was abuse. But her mother was in that hospital, suffering every day. And if marrying this arrogant, cruel man was the only way to save her, then she would do it. She would endure anything for her. I do, she finally said, her voice clear and firm. John glanced at her sideways, surprised. Something in the way she spoke that word made him frown. It wasn't just an acceptance. There was a subtle challenge in it, a promise that she wouldn't be the silent victim he expected. Yes, I do too, he growled with contempt, almost spitting the words. The judge nodded without emotion and asked them to step forward to sign the marriage certificate. John grabbed the pen with a brusque gesture and scribbled his name furiously, while Elena did so more carefully, trying not to let her hand tremble. When both had signed, the judge looked up and gave them a weary look. By the authority vested in me by law, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Elena felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The judge's words echoed in her ears like an irrevocable sentence. She turned to John, expecting at least a formal gesture, a handshake, a minimal sign of respect. But John simply turned around, ignoring her completely. He began walking toward the exit without looking at her once, leaving Elena and the few witnesses who had attended that farce of a ceremony behind. Murmurs and glances of pity toward her filled the air as they watched him leave, furious, as if the mere idea of being near her made him sick. Elena pressed her lips together, feeling the sting of tears in her eyes. She wouldn't let them see her cry. Not now. Not in front of all those strangers. She took a deep breath and followed him out, her head held high, walking with slow, dignified steps. When she reached the outside, John was leaning against his car, staring off into the distance. She stopped a few steps away from him, unsure of what to say. The tension between them was palpable, almost suffocating. This changes nothing, he said suddenly, without turning to look at her. You're just a tool, something temporary. Don't expect me to treat you like a wife. Don't expect anything. Elena felt something break inside her, but she forced herself to stand tall. I expect nothing from you, John, she responded firmly. I didn't choose this, and believe me, if I could avoid it, I would. But don't worry. I won't interfere in your life more than necessary. John turned slowly, surprised by her response. He looked into her eyes, searching for any trace of fear or submission. But he found none. He only saw a mix of resignation and strength he didn't understand. Very well, he said coldly. Then stay out of my way. He opened the car door and got in without looking at her again. Elena stood on the sidewalk, watching as the car roared to life and disappeared into the distance. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The marriage had begun, and she could already feel the scars it would leave. But she wouldn't let herself falter. She would endure. Because if there was one thing Elena knew how to do, it was fight. The morning of the move arrived cold and rainy, as if the weather reflected the bitter reality John and Elena were about to face. It had only been 2 days since their wedding, and it already felt like they were trapped in a purgatory they couldn't escape. John stood at the wide entrance of the Edwards mansion, staring incredulously at the old moving truck, waiting to take all his belongings to their new home. This is ridiculous, he muttered through clenched teeth, his fists so tight his knuckles turned white. Henry watched from the threshold, his expression as unyielding as ever. There was no trace of compassion on his face, only the same cold, calculating look he used when closing a business deal. I warned you there would be conditions, he said sternly. If you think you can keep living in this mansion, surrounded by luxury, after what you did, then you've understood nothing. This apartment is part of the punishment, John. Learn to adapt or keep ruining your life. But I won't give you more chances. Elena, standing beside John, watched in silence. She was dressed simply, jeans and a white t-shirt. She looked out of place in that marble and ornate columned setting, as if she were a tangible reminder of how far John had fallen. Yet she showed no signs of resentment. She had accepted her fate with the same calm she faced every obstacle in her life. "I'm not doing it for myself. I'm doing it for her," she repeated over and over as she looked at John, waiting for him to move. The apartment they were going to wasn't in the city center, nor in an exclusive neighborhood like the ones John was used to frequenting. It was in a modest area, in an old complex of buildings with walls stained by moisture and the passage of time. The windows were surrounded by rusty frames, and the main entrance had a crooked "For Rent" sign hanging on it. There was a small neglected garden beside it, with a few wilted flowers struggling to survive in the barren soil. John stepped out of the sports car, looking at the place with absolute disgust. "This is a joke, right?" he spat at Elena, his voice dripping with contempt. "I'm not living in a place like this. I'm not a damn homeless man." Elena met his gaze, feeling a weariness settle deep into her bones. The journey had been long and tense, without a single word exchanged between them, just the heavy presence of John's hostility lingering in the air. "It's where your father said we'd be staying," she replied calmly. "If you want to leave, no one's stopping you, John. But I'm staying here." John let out a bitter, joyless laugh. He ran a hand through his hair, messing it up, and looked at the building again with disbelief. He couldn't believe it. He, the heir of the Edwards family, forced to live in a dump like this. "This is pathetic," he muttered, turning back toward the car as if he wanted to get in and drive away forever. But then he remembered his father's words. If he left now, he would lose everything. Not just his inheritance, but any chance of reclaiming his pride. Henry wanted him destroyed, reduced to nothing, and he wouldn't give him that satisfaction. With a frustrated growl, he grabbed one of the boxes the movers had unloaded from the truck and lifted it, though it was clear he wasn't used to carrying weight. He walked toward the entrance of the building, head down, shoulders tense. Elena followed silently, watching as he struggled to keep his composure. She didn't say anything. There was no need. The walls John had built around himself were starting to crack, and it was evident in every harsh gesture and every curse muttered under his breath. The apartment was on the 3rd floor. When they entered, John stopped dead, staring around in disbelief. The main room was small, with cream-colored walls that had lost their luster, a couple of empty shelves, and a worn wooden dining table. The windows let in light through cheap curtains, and the furniture was far from luxurious. There were just a couple of simple sofas and a small, outdated TV in one corner. Elena set her bag down on the floor and looked around the room. It was modest, yes, but it was clean and livable. She couldn't complain. She had lived in worse places. However, John's furious silence was so palpable that it almost seemed to fill the room. "This isn't a home," he finally exploded, throwing the box onto the floor with such force that its contents spilled out everywhere. Documents and personal items scattered across the grey carpet, but John didn't seem to notice. He was so blinded by rage that he could barely think straight. "Is this what you want? To humiliate me like this? To make me live like a miserable wretch?" Elena remained composed, taking a deep breath before responding. "It's not my intention to humiliate you, John," she said softly. "But if we're going to stay here, at least try not to make it worse than it already is. We're all making sacrifices." "Sacrifices?" John looked at her incredulously, his eyes blazing with fury. "What sacrifices are you making? You're just a cleaner who got lucky to trap someone like me. You're—" He stopped when he saw Elena's expression harden. Something in her gaze made him fall silent. He had seen sadness, disappointment, even fear in other women, but he had never seen anyone look at him with such silent disdain. "I'm the woman who married you to save her mother," she answered, her voice firm. "I'm not here by choice. And believe me, I don't want to be here any more than you want me to be. But I won't stand by while you ruin everything. So please, if you want to vent your anger, do it far away from me." John blinked, surprised by the strength in her voice. Something in her words reminded him of his own father, that determination not to give an inch, not to let anyone trample over them. But he wouldn't allow it. He wouldn't let a mere cleaner look at him as if he were the one who was worthless. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low and filled with venom. "Then stay out of my way. You stay in your corner, and I'll stay in mine. This isn't a home for either of us, and it never will be." Elena watched as he turned and stormed off toward what was supposed to be the master bedroom, slamming the door behind him. She remained in the living room, surrounded by the boxes and the mess, feeling more alone than ever. But she took a deep breath, picked up the box he had thrown, and began to tidy up in silence. "You won't break," she told herself firmly. "You won't let him win. This is just another test. It will pass, and you'll walk out of here with your head held high." She repeated those words to herself over and over as she organized the small apartment, mentally preparing for the battle of wills that had just begun. Monday morning arrived with a sense of uncertainty. The sun had barely risen when John and Elena found themselves standing in front of the small office building that would be their new workplace. The Edwards Corporate branch wasn't the imposing headquarters John was used to visiting. It was a modest two-story brick building with a faded sign that was barely legible. The paint on the facade was chipped, and the front entrance looked somewhat neglected, with empty flower pots on either side. John looked at the place with a grimace of disgust. He had never been there before. His father had made sure that this branch was so far removed from his interests that he practically didn't even know it existed. He had only heard of it when it was mentioned as one of the company's least profitable subsidiaries. And now, here he was, forced to work as just another employee in this forgotten place. Elena, on the other hand, looked at the entrance with neutral eyes. It wasn't a luxurious building, but it had a simple charm. She had faced far more difficult situations and tougher workplaces. For her, a roof and a safe environment were more than she had hoped for after that forced marriage. "It's not too late to turn back," John said sarcastically, without looking at her. Elena remained silent, studying the building. Her eyes scanned the windows with crooked blinds and the barely visible sign. Then she took a deep breath and turned to him. "I'm not leaving." She said it calmly, as if there were no other option. And for her, there wasn't. John sighed in frustration, and they both entered the building in silence. The interior of the office was simply and functionally arranged. A modest reception area, a couple of desks piled high with papers, and employees bustling back and forth. Heads turned when the door opened, and murmurs began immediately. No one expected to see John Edwards, the magnate's son, show up in a place like that, and even less accompanied by a woman dressed in plain, modest clothes. "Is that him?" someone whispered near the door. "Yes, it's the heir. But why is he here?" another asked, frowning in confusion. John felt each of those stares like needles piercing his skin. He wasn't used to being looked at with disdain, or worse, with pity. He strode forward with long, determined steps, pretending none of it mattered. But his clenched jaw and fists said otherwise. Mr. Coleman, the branch manager, appeared at the end of the hallway, walking toward them with quick, firm strides. He was a tall man, with graying hair and a severe expression on his face. He wore a modest gray suit that contrasted sharply with the impeccable appearance John was used to seeing on the executives at the main office. His gaze was hard and direct, like someone who had no time for nonsense. "John Edwards, welcome," Coleman said in a deep voice that echoed in the small reception area. "And you must be Elena." He gave her a brief nod before turning his attention back to John. "Your father has informed me of your arrival. But let me be clear from the start. Here, you're not John Edwards, the heir. You're just another new employee, and you'll be treated as such." John felt the humiliation burn inside him like a flame. How dare this man speak to him like that? He was an Edwards. But before he could say anything, Coleman turned to Elena with a slight professional smile. "Elena, I've reviewed your file. It seems you have experience as a supervisor in maintenance tasks, We need someone with your skills to oversee the cleaning staff and the safety conditions in this branch." Then, with a serious look, he added, "This place needs a lot of improvement. I hope you can help us with that." Elena nodded, feeling a slight sense of relief. At least her position wouldn't be as degrading as she had feared. She would have some autonomy, and that would help her endure the difficult situation with John. "I'll do my best, Mr. Coleman," she replied respectfully. Coleman nodded approvingly, then turned back to John. "And you, John," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "you'll start in the basic administration area. You'll be filing documents, organizing records, and assisting with whatever tasks are assigned to you. And let me be clear, there will be no special privileges for you. If you expect preferential treatment, you're in the wrong place." John felt the blood rush to his face, but he clenched his teeth and held back. He wouldn't give Coleman the satisfaction of seeing him explode. He nodded his head without saying a word. "Very well. I'll show you to your workstations. Follow me," Coleman ordered, turning around and walking down the hallway. John and Elena exchanged a brief glance before following him. When they reached the small office where John would be working, his indignation reached a new level. The place was crammed with papers and folders piled up on old, worn-out shelves. There was a tiny desk with an uncomfortable chair, and the computer looked like it was from the dinosaur era. "What is this?" John asked with a mix of disbelief and barely contained fury. "I'm not working in a dump like this." Coleman stopped and turned to face him, looking him straight in the eyes. "This, John, is a workplace like any other. It might not be what you're used to, but you'll get used to it. And if you don't like it, well..." He smiled with a coldness that made John want to punch something. "You can always quit." The silence in the room was suffocating. John and Coleman stared at each other, testing the other's resolve. But finally, John looked away, defeated. He knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. And certainly not without giving his father another reason to gloat. "Understood," he muttered through gritted teeth. Coleman nodded. "Perfect. Then let's get started. And Elena, your workspace is on the ground floor." He gestured to the staircase. "You can begin by drafting a report on the current safety conditions. We have several issues that need addressing." Elena nodded respectfully and made her way downstairs. As she descended, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for John. What his father was doing was more than just a punishment. It was an attempt to break his spirit and leave him in ruins. But despite everything, John had to learn a lesson. And if that meant enduring his anger and frustration for a while, then so be it. But when John was left alone in his small cubicle, he felt desperation wash over him. Every corner of that office was a reminder of how far he had fallen. He wasn't the admired and respected heir he was used to being. He was just another employee in a small, forgotten branch. And as he sat in that uncomfortable chair and began filing papers in silence, a promise formed inside him. He would find a way out of this hole. But it wouldn't be through humiliation or submission. He would do it his way, and no one, neither his father nor that cleaner, would stop him. The first week at the branch passed slowly, filled with tension and resentment. John could barely tolerate the endless hours of tedious, repetitive work. The sound of the old typewriter keys and the buzz of the fluorescent lamp in his cubicle were unbearable. He had gone from giving orders to being stuck in an insignificant position, filing papers and doing tasks he considered degrading. Each day he spent in that cramped, dull space, his hatred grew stronger and stronger. But more than the office, more than the mundane tasks he was assigned, what really ate away at him was watching Elena move about with such calm and efficiency. From the very first moment, she had earned the admiration of the other employees, who respected her for her dedication and hard work. "It's amazing how she solved that safety issue in just 3 days," one administrator commented, watching her from a distance as she spoke with a group of workers downstairs. "Not just that, she also volunteered to cover extra shifts when we were short-staffed," added another. "She definitely doesn't act like someone who's here just on a whim." John listened to those comments with growing resentment. He was used to being the center of attention, to having everyone look at him with respect, even if it was just because of his last name. But here, in this forgotten office, it was Elena who drew all the admiring glances, while he was nothing more than a shadow. One day, that simmering fury boiled over. Determined to prove that his presence at the branch was a farce, John started sabotaging his own work. He intentionally misplaced important files, disorganized records, and on one occasion entered incorrect information into a financial report. His goal was clear: to make things go so wrong that the manager would have no choice but to fire him and put an end to this humiliation. At first, the employees were confused. Some thought John was simply inexperienced and didn't understand his tasks. But when the mistakes became too frequent and disrupted the entire office's workflow, complaints began piling up. "This is the third report that's had errors, John," a supervisor yelled, slamming a folder down on his desk. "Can't you even do this right?" John shrugged, feigning indifference. "Maybe I'm just not cut out for this kind of work. Ever thought of that?" he replied with a mocking smile. But not everyone was willing to ignore his attitude. The breaking point came one afternoon, when Mr. Coleman was informed that one of John's mistakes had caused a delay in a major project, putting a key contract for the branch at risk. "John, in my office!" Coleman roared, his face red with rage. John got up slowly from his chair, dragging his feet with obvious reluctance. As he walked toward Coleman's office, he felt Elena's gaze on him from the ground floor. She had been watching his behavior, silently, without intervening. But now, something in her expression had changed, a mixture of disappointment and frustration. When John entered the office, Coleman looked at him with narrowed eyes, clearly struggling to control his temper. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked in a dangerously calm tone. "Excuse me," John feigned innocence, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Your incompetence almost cost us the contract with Morgan Industries," Coleman growled. "And don't tell me it was a mistake, because I've been told you have a record of deliberately messing things up." John stared at him coldly, not bothering to deny anything. "If I'm causing you so much trouble, why don't you just fire me?" Coleman glared at him. "Because I don't want to give you the satisfaction. I don't know what plan you think you're carrying out, but I can promise you one thing: you won't win. You'll work here like everyone else, or you'll face the consequences." John clenched his jaw. He had hoped his tactic would be enough to get him out of this hell. But Coleman was more stubborn than he had imagined. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the office, deliberately bumping into Elena, who was standing just outside the door. "And what are you looking at?" he spat, his eyes blazing with barely contained fury. Elena looked at him with a calmness that only enraged him more. "I'm looking at a child who is ruining the work of people who truly need it," she said quietly. John froze. He hadn't expected that. Elena almost never challenged him directly, but this time her voice was laden with disappointment and something else, something that made him feel small and pathetic. "What did you say?" he murmured incredulously. Elena stood taller, crossing her arms, her gaze locked onto his, without a trace of fear. "I said you're acting like a child." Her tone was firm, almost cold. "You might think that sabotaging your own work only affects Mr. Coleman or your father, but you're wrong. There are employees here who depend on this job to feed their families, people who struggle every day, and you're playing with their lives as if none of this mattered." John felt the blood burn in his cheeks, his pride wounded by the truth in her words. He leaned in, trying to intimidate her. "You know nothing about what I'm going through," he growled, his face just inches from hers. "You have no idea what it's like to be trapped in this." Elena didn't back down. Her eyes were like ice, impenetrable and cold. "No, I don't," she admitted. "But I do know that I'm not here by choice, just like you. And yet, I'm trying to do my best. If you can't handle it, leave, but don't drag everyone else down with you." The intensity in her voice left him speechless. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the tension between them palpable. Then, finally, John looked away, swallowing the words he wanted to scream at her. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing there, feeling more vulnerable and shaken than she'd ever been. Elena watched him leave, feeling a mixture of pity and anger. John was a child trapped in a man's body, unable to see beyond his own suffering. But if he thought she was going to let him destroy everything that was being built at that branch, he was sorely mistaken. That afternoon, as John walked alone through the office, he felt something new. It wasn't just rage or resentment, it was the sensation of having been truly seen. For the first time in a long while, someone had looked at him as a human being, not just as the problematic heir of Henry Edwards. But that didn't change anything, he told himself bitterly. He wouldn't give up. He would do whatever it took to escape this hell. Although, for the first time, he wasn't sure how to deal with the one person who, unintentionally, had started to challenge him. The following weeks passed slowly, as if time had come to a standstill in that forgotten corner of the corporate world. However, something in the daily routine of the branch was changing. Elena's presence was becoming increasingly noticeable among the employees, who began to turn to her for advice and support. And although no one said it out loud, everyone knew that somehow she was becoming a natural leader, even in an environment where her position held no formal authority. John, on the other hand, kept to himself, watching from the shadows as things seemed to slowly improve at the branch. He didn't understand what was happening. He only knew that, with each passing day, he felt more isolated and out of place. One afternoon, while he struggled to keep his attention on a tedious financial report, he heard laughter coming from downstairs. He stood up from his chair in annoyance and looked over the railing of the second floor, peering down at Elena's workspace. To his surprise, he saw several employees gathered around a table where she stood, smiling slightly as she explained something. "So, if we move the cleaning supplies to the back storage area, we'll avoid the risk of accidents in the hallways," she was saying calmly, pointing to a diagram on the makeshift whiteboard. "And we can implement a rotating schedule to ensure that each section is covered without overburdening anyone." The employees, men and women of various ages, nodded enthusiastically. John noticed Mr. Coleman watching from a corner, arms crossed, and a slight smile of approval on his face. There was something in his expression that deeply irritated John. He stormed down the stairs, his irritation growing with each step. When he reached the bottom, he shoved the meeting room door open, bursting abruptly into the conversation. The murmur died instantly. Everyone turned to look at him, surprised and a little tense. Elena looked up, maintaining her neutral expression, but something in her eyes held a flicker of defiance. "What's going on here?" John demanded harshly, glaring at each of them. "Is this some kind of secret party during work hours?" An awkward silence followed. The employees exchanged nervous glances, and a few took a step back. But it was Elena who broke the silence, with a calmness that John found infuriating. "We're discussing some proposals to improve safety in the workplace," she explained. "Accidents have decreased by 20% since we started implementing these changes." "Changes?" John repeated sarcastically. "Since when do you make decisions in this office?" Elena held his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by his tone. She knew John was trying to provoke her, trying to make her lose her composure in front of everyone, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I don't make decisions." Her voice was soft but clear. "I just make suggestions, but these suggestions have made the employees work more safely and created a more productive environment. And that's something Mr. Coleman supports." John noticed how the others nodded, with faint smiles and admiring looks directed at her. It was as if Elena had managed in a few weeks to do what he hadn't done his entire life, earn people's respect for who she was, not for her last name. He felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't the image he had of Elena, the woman who had been chosen to humiliate him. She wasn't playing her part. She wasn't being the passive victim he expected her to be. "That's ridiculous," he finally spat. Do you think you can save this dump of an office with a couple of changes? This is all a waste of time." Elena took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. She stood tall and with a calm voice replied, "Maybe it is. But even if it's a small change, it means a lot to these people. They don't have other opportunities like you, John. They don't have a powerful last name to back them up if everything goes to hell. So if I can make their work a little safer, a little more dignified, then I'll keep doing it, whether you understand it or not." The silence that followed was deafening. John looked at each of the employees. There was no mockery in their eyes, no resentment. There was only respect. Genuine respect for a woman who was doing something meaningful for them. And suddenly, he felt smaller than ever. "Do whatever you want," he muttered, turning abruptly. "I don't care." He left the room with quick steps, feeling everyone's eyes on his back. He went back to his cubicle on the second floor and collapsed into his chair, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps from the mixture of humiliation and fury consuming him. How was it possible that someone like her, a mere cleaner, could make him feel so insignificant? The following days were a constant struggle. He tried to ignore her, tried to despise her, but he couldn't help noticing how every small change she proposed seemed to have a real impact. The employees listened to her, respected her, even admired her. And, to top it off, Mr. Coleman had started seeking her opinion in team meetings, something that was completely unusual in such a hierarchical environment. One afternoon, as he strained to focus on a report, he overheard two employees talking in the hallway. Elena's resource waste reduction project saved over $5,000 this month. Yeah, and not just that. Productivity has gone up. Even the atmosphere here feels different. There's more, I don't know, optimism. John felt a sharp pain in his chest, a mixture of jealousy and something else he didn't want to acknowledge. The idea that someone he considered beneath him was achieving what he never had was almost unbearable. But deep down, something in him was beginning to change. He wouldn't admit it out loud, not even to himself, but he couldn't stop looking at Elena with different eyes. She was doing what he had never done, creating a positive impact. And for the first time in his life, John began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something more he could do too. Something within him, something deep and long forgotten, started to stir. It was just a spark, barely a flicker of something new. But it was there, and that scared him more than anything else. Because if he, John Edwards, could learn something from a mere cleaner, what did that mean for everything he had always believed about himself? But he wasn't ready to accept that truth, not yet. He forced himself to focus on his work, to ignore the voices of admiration toward Elena, to ignore that small, annoying feeling of respect that was beginning to emerge. And so, as the first hint of change appeared within him, John kept fighting against it, not knowing that this small spark would grow and change his life forever. The atmosphere in the branch had changed dramatically over the past few weeks. Although the employees were more motivated and the small improvements Elena had implemented had created a more productive environment, the office's future remained uncertain. The branch was on the brink of closure, and everyone knew it. Rumors about the possible shutdown of the branch spread like wildfire. News that Edwards Corp had decided to downsize and close underperforming branches filled the air with anxiety. Worried glances, nervous murmurs in the hallways, and whispers about the looming loss of jobs were constant. John paced around the office like a caged animal. The pressure of the situation was affecting him more than he was willing to admit. Despite all his attempts to maintain a facade of indifference, the possibility of failure was eating him alive. He had come to the conclusion that his time in that office was a final test from his father, a last challenge to decide whether John deserved to return to the main company or be exiled for good. One afternoon, Mr. Coleman called an emergency meeting. His expression was graver than usual as he addressed the employees. "The situation is critical," he announced firmly. Our performance reports aren't good enough to keep this branch running. If we don't significantly improve our numbers in the coming weeks, the office will be shut down, and everyone will lose their jobs." The silence that followed his words was suffocating. Everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath, and fear was written all over the employees' faces. Their job's future hung by a thread, and there was no clear plan to save the situation. John, sitting at the back of the room, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew that, even if he didn't say it out loud, the closure of the branch would mean his final failure. His father would see it as a failed test, confirmation of what he had always believed, that John was incapable of handling any real responsibility. After the meeting, John left the conference room with long, determined strides, but inside he felt overwhelmed. He knew he was lost. Frustration and desperation consumed him. He leaned against a wall, rubbing his temples as he tried to control the growing sense of failure. That's when he saw her. Elena was standing by a window, looking out. Her expression was serene, but there was a tension in her shoulders that revealed she was worried too. John watched her in silence for a few seconds. There was something in her posture, in the way she faced every challenge with calmness and determination, that disarmed him. And painful as it was to admit, he knew she was the key to saving the branch. Taking a deep breath, John walked over to her. "I need your help," he said abruptly, without preamble. Elena turned slowly to face him, surprised by his words. For weeks he had been arrogant and distant, and this sudden confession made him seem vulnerable for the first time. "My help?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Why should I help you?" John clenched his teeth. He didn't like being in this position, but he knew he had no other choice. The weight of the situation forced him to set aside his pride. "Because I can't do it alone," he admitted tensely. "You know as well as I do that this branch is in danger. If we don't do something now, everything will go to hell. And I don't just mean the employees' jobs. This also means my future in the company." Elena watched him in silence, evaluating his tone and words. She had expected anything from John except a sincere request for help. Finally, she sighed and crossed her arms. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, still unconvinced. John paused, choosing his words carefully. He had spent days thinking of a plan, but he knew it wouldn't succeed without her. He needed her perspective, her ability to connect with the employees, and her knowledge of how that office really worked. "I want us to work together," he finally said. "You and me. We can save this office if we join forces. You have the employees' respect, and you've managed to improve things here that I didn't even notice. We need to come up with a plan to increase productivity and profits, something that will convince my father and the board that this branch can be profitable." Elena looked at him intently, as if weighing every word he had just spoken. She knew that John wasn't someone who asked for help easily, and his request showed that the situation was truly dire. But she also knew she couldn't simply trust him immediately. "If I agree to help, there will be conditions," she said firmly. John nodded, feeling like he was about to swallow his pride. "Tell me what they are." Elena met his eyes, her tone firm and without a trace of doubt. "First, I don't want you using your last name or your connections for this. If we're going to save this office, it will be through the work we do here, not through favors or influence. And second, if we work together, it will be as equals. I won't be your subordinate. You'll have to learn to listen and respect my opinions, even if you don't like them." John looked at her in silence. He had expected conditions, but hearing her speak with such authority and confidence made him feel a faint respect for her, even if he didn't want to admit it. He knew what she was asking for was fair, and that without her, he had no chance of success. "Agreed," he finally said, his voice softer than usual. "As equals." Elena nodded, accepting his answer. There was a seriousness in her eyes that indicated she wouldn't allow herself to be manipulated or used. "Very well," she said. "Then let's start right away. If we want to save this branch, we'll have to work together without rest. We'll need to reorganize the workflow, improve communication between departments, and find ways to reduce operational costs without affecting service quality. And most importantly, we need to get the employees fully on board. We can't do this alone. John nodded, feeling a new determination start to grow inside him. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for an easy way out. He was willing to work hard, to get his hands dirty if necessary. Days and nights passed as they worked side by side in a shared space that had once been filled with tension but was now beginning to transform into something more collaborative. As they advanced with their plan, heated discussions alternated with moments of silent respect. John began to notice how Elena approached problems with both logic and empathy, something he had never considered important. Slowly, they started to share more than just ideas, fragments of their personal lives, anecdotes from the past, and sometimes silences that didn't need to be filled. As the days went by, the relationship of rivalry slowly transformed into something closer to an alliance. And although neither was willing to admit it, both knew they were starting to change. Together, they were building something bigger than just a business strategy. The first few weeks of working together were difficult and tense for John and Elena. At first, they argued frequently, clashing over almost every decision, from which department should receive more attention to the smallest details of shift organization. John wasn't used to being challenged, and Elena wasn't willing to back down. However, each disagreement, each clash of ideas, ultimately led them to common ground that they wouldn't have reached alone. Slowly, the lines of communication began to open, and the results became evident. Their first victory came when they implemented a new time management system that increased production efficiency by 15%. Although it seemed like a small achievement, it was a crucial step in proving that change was possible. The atmosphere at the branch also began to improve. The employees, seeing John and Elena working tirelessly together, began to regain hope. The initially cold and distant relationship that surrounded them transformed into a feeling of camaraderie. They were no longer the arrogant heir and the cleaner. They were two people fighting for the same goal. One afternoon, John and Elena were in the small meeting room they had turned into their improvised headquarters. Performance charts and workflow tables covered the walls. The lights flickered dimly overhead, and exhaustion was etched on their faces. Despite everything, they kept working, fueled only by coffee and the growing sense that they were on the brink of achieving something important. "If we restructure the logistics department," Elena said, pointing to a diagram on the board, "we could save 20% on transportation costs, and if we manage to reduce downtime on the production line, those savings could be reinvested in improving safety conditions for the workers." John watched her as she spoke, noting her focused expression and how each of her suggestions had a clear purpose. He realized, with a certain sense of amazement, that she didn't just think in terms of numbers and statistics. She thought about people. Every change, every improvement, always considered the employees, their lives, and their conditions. And that was what set her apart from any other executive he had ever worked with. "And if we achieve those savings," John added, his voice softer than usual, "we could present the results to the board ahead of time. My father would think the branch is no longer a burden and would give us more resources to keep it running." Elena nodded, but then she frowned, looking at him attentively. "It's not just about that, John." Her tone was firm, but not harsh. "It's not just about showing your father positive numbers. It's about showing the people here that their work has value, that we're fighting for more than just saving our positions. We're fighting to save their livelihoods." John remained silent. That was the difference between them, he thought. For him, saving the branch meant redeeming his own reputation, and maybe finally proving to his father that he could do something right. For Elena, it meant saving the dignity and future of the workers. "I know," he finally said, his tone more sincere than it had been in months. "And I want them to know that too. We're going to show everyone that this branch deserves a chance, not just to make money, but because it can really make a difference." Elena looked into his eyes, surprised by his tone. There was something new in him, a glimmer of conviction she hadn't seen before. It was as if he was finally starting to understand what was truly at stake. "Good," she said with a faint smile. "Then let's do it." The change started slowly, but once it was set in motion, it was unstoppable. John and Elena worked late into the night, going over every detail of the operation. They spent entire days visiting each department, talking to the employees, listening to their concerns, and adjusting their strategies accordingly. One of the main improvements was in the production department. Elena suggested redesigning the workflow so that tasks were divided more efficiently, eliminating bottlenecks that were delaying operations. At first, the workers were skeptical. They were used to following orders, not being asked for their opinions. But Elena insisted on involving them in the process. "If you see something that's not working," she told them one morning, "let me know. This isn't just a top-down order. I want you to be part of the change." The employees looked at her, surprised, but gradually they began to speak up. Suggestions and comments came from all sides, and Elena took them into account. John, watching from the back of the room, realized that she had achieved what he had never even attempted, earning their trust. The improvements in production quickly translated into increased efficiency, and the financial reports began to reflect those changes. Mr. Coleman, who had been skeptical at first, started to see tangible results. "I don't know how you've done it," he said one afternoon, looking over the latest performance report, "but you've managed to improve this branch's metrics in record time." Elena smiled modestly, but John felt a faint sense of pride growing in his chest. He knew it was thanks to Elena, but he also felt that he had contributed in some way. And that feeling, the feeling of having done something meaningful, was new and refreshing to him. But the biggest change came when the employees, who had once feared for their jobs, began to feel motivated. It was evident in the way they arrived early, in how they volunteered for additional shifts, and in how they took the time to ensure that every task was done correctly. One day, while they were walking through the production floor, one of the senior employees approached John. He was a man in his 50s, with a face weathered by time and hands calloused from years of work. "Mr. Edwards," he said in a rough voice, scratching the back of his neck nervously, "I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't think anyone cared about us, but you and Mrs. Elena have shown that not everything is lost. For the first time in a long time, I feel like it's worth making an effort." John looked at him, stunned. He had never received genuine gratitude like that. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded. "Thank you," he muttered awkwardly. "You're the one doing all the hard work." The man smiled and returned to his place on the production line, leaving John with an unexpected feeling of warmth. That night, as he reviewed reports with Elena, he found himself smiling for no apparent reason. "You're in a good mood today," Elena observed, raising an eyebrow. "I suppose I am," John admitted, surprised by his own response. "It's just, I don't know. It feels like we're really accomplishing something here. I never thought I could feel good doing this." Elena looked at him, and for a moment her eyes softened. "Maybe it's because you're starting to see the value in things you didn't consider important before." John met her gaze, and something shifted inside him. Yes, he was starting to see things differently, and for the first time, he didn't mind it at all. The late-night work sessions at the branch became a routine for John and Elena. With the office almost empty and only the dim light from the desks illuminating the room, they felt isolated from the rest of the world, as if that small workspace was a refuge where external problems couldn't reach them. They spent hours going over reports, adjusting strategies, and planning how to implement more improvements. But it wasn't all work. Little by little, their conversations became more personal. One night, as they were reviewing a particularly complicated financial report, John let out a frustrated sigh and rubbed his temples. "I never thought I'd end up doing this," he murmured, leaning back in his chair and staring at the ceiling as if expecting to find answers there. "You know, I always thought I'd be running one of the company's major divisions, not sitting here dealing with inventory calculations and employee schedules." Elena looked up from the documents and regarded him with curiosity. "And why didn't you?" she asked in a neutral tone, without a hint of sarcasm or judgment in her voice. John fell silent for a moment, surprised by the question. No one had ever asked him that before. Everyone always assumed he was a failure because he was lazy and spoiled, but for some reason, with Elena, he didn't want to lie or hide the truth. "I guess I never believed I could do it," he finally admitted, lowering his gaze to his hands, which were nervously fiddling with a pen. "I've always been the son who wasn't good enough. My father saw me as a disappointment from the start, and after hearing that over and over again, you start to believe it." Elena stared at him, surprised by his honesty. It was the first time John had shown real vulnerability in front of her. It took her a moment to process his words. She was used to seeing him as an arrogant, spoiled man, but this John before her was someone struggling with deeply rooted insecurities. "Sometimes," she said softly, choosing her words carefully, "people put us in roles we don't deserve, and it's easy to believe that's our destiny. But it doesn't mean we can't change it." John looked at her, his frown softening as he considered her words. "And what about you?" he asked after a moment. "Did you always want to be a cleaner?" She finished with a small smile. "No, of course not. I wanted to be an architect. I always dreamed of designing buildings and structures that would transform the way people live and work. But life doesn't always turn out the way you expect." John felt a pang of surprise. He hadn't imagined that. In his mind, he had always seen Elena as someone who was content, someone who accepted her role without complaint. But now he understood that she too had dreams she had had to leave behind. "What happened?" he asked softly. Elena sighed and looked away, her eyes focusing on a distant point as if she were reliving a painful memory. "My parents died in an accident when I was 16, she said quietly. "I was left alone with my younger sister. I had to work to support both of us. So I dropped out of school and started doing whatever it took to get by." She shrugged, with a sad smile. "Life doesn't always let you choose." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken emotions. John felt a surge of respect for her. She had been through far more than he had ever imagined, and yet she remained strong. While he had been complaining about his punishment, she had been facing far greater challenges without a single complaint. "You're stronger than you look," he finally said, his voice soft. Elena smiled slightly, a glimmer of warmth lighting up her eyes. "I don't know if I'm strong. I just do what I have to do. In the end, we all do, right? Even you." John looked at her intently, trying to understand how someone could keep going with so much resilience. Something stirred inside him. For the first time, he felt the need to prove to someone that he, too, could be more than what he seemed. That he wasn't just a spoiled rich kid. He wanted her to see him as something more. "I suppose you're right," he admitted, his voice filled with a sincerity that even surprised himself. Over the following weeks, that connection continued to deepen. John began seeking her opinions, even on matters unrelated to their work, asking her about her dreams, her past, her view of the world. And Elena, little by little, began to open up more. She shared memories of her childhood, her happiest moments, and also her darkest fears. One night, after an exhausting day of work, John surprised her with an unexpected question. "How do you manage to stay so grounded?" he asked, leaning back in his chair and looking at her with genuine curiosity. Elena blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You never fall apart," he explained, gesturing with his hands. "You always seem calm, even when everything's in chaos. I explode. But you just stay composed. How do you do it?" Elena smiled sadly and shrugged. "I guess it's because I've lost so much that I'm no longer afraid of losing more. When you've lost everything once, you realize you can start over. And then, the fear disappears. John stared at her, feeling her words resonate deeply within him. He had spent his entire life fearing failure, fearing disappointing his father, fearing not measuring up. But Elena, she had faced the abyss and come out the other side. "You're incredible," he murmured without thinking. Elena laughed softly. "No, I'm just persistent." But John wasn't convinced. He saw her with new eyes, and in those eyes there was no longer just resentment or rivalry. There was something more, something deeper, more complicated. And that scared him. Because for the first time in a long time, he realized that he admired someone more than himself. One night, as they reviewed the latest financial results, Elena fell asleep at the table. John looked up and watched her. Her features softened, and her breathing became gentle. There was something incredibly vulnerable about seeing her like that, exhausted, but still determined to keep going. He felt a strange urge to protect her, to make sure she wouldn't have to bear any more burdens. Shaking his head, he sighed. He stood up carefully, grabbed a jacket hanging on a chair, and draped it gently over her shoulders to keep her warm. He stood there for a long moment, watching her before returning to his seat. "Thank you, Elena," he whispered, even though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Thank you for everything." And then, for the first time since they had started this strange marriage, John allowed himself to accept that Elena was more than just a simple cleaner. She was the person who had begun to change him. And although he didn't know what that meant for the future, he was willing to find out. The news arrived like an earthquake that shook the foundation of the branch. That day, employees were running around nervously. Anxious whispers filled the hallways, and everyone was murmuring the same phrase, "Mr. Edwards is here." They weren't talking about John, but Henry Edwards, the titan who ran the company with an iron fist. His arrival was unexpected and full of implications. John was in the meeting room when he heard the news. The world seemed to freeze around him. He stood still, unable to process what he had just heard. His father had come to the branch, but why? Had everything he and Elena worked for not been enough? Panic flooded him. "John," Elena whispered from the doorway, her voice filled with concern, "I just got word. Your father is here, and he wants to see us in his office immediately." John swallowed hard and nodded slowly. His whole body felt tense, as if bracing for an inevitable battle. Elena noticed the pallor on his face and stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll be fine," she said calmly. "We've worked hard, John. They can't take that away from us." He looked at her, and for a moment he saw the confidence she felt reflected in her eyes. But he also knew that Henry was not someone easy to impress, much less to deceive. Everything they had built, all the achievements and small victories, could be swept away in an instant with just one word from his father. He took a deep breath and nodded. "We'll face him," he murmured, trying to summon his courage. "Together." They both walked toward the main office where Henry was waiting. When they entered, they saw him standing by the large window overlooking the exterior, his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze fixed on the horizon. He seemed calm, but there was something dangerous in his posture, in the rigidity of his shoulders. "Father," John greeted, his voice more hesitant than he wanted it to be. Henry turned slowly, his steely eyes locking onto his son with an intensity that almost made John step back. Then he shifted his gaze to Elena, examining her from head to toe as if she were an insect under his microscope. A flash of disdain crossed his features, but it quickly dissipated, replaced by a mask of absolute control. "John, Miss Rodriguez," he said in a cold tone, devoid of any emotion. "I've heard some interesting rumors about this little branch. They say you've managed to improve the numbers and productivity." His eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm here to see if that's true, or just another one of your illusions, son." John clenched his fists, feeling the anger begin to bubble up inside him. Even after everything, his father still wouldn't give him the benefit of the doubt. It was as if he were just waiting for him to fail so he could say, "I told you so." "It's not an illusion," John replied firmly, stepping forward. "We've implemented significant changes. Productivity is up by 30%, and we've reduced operating costs by 18% over the last month." Henry looked at him with a cold smile. "We," he repeated softly, his eyes drifting over to Elena. "I didn't realize you and Miss Rodriguez were a team." Elena stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "With all due respect, Mr. Edwards, John and I have been working as a team to improve this branch. He has shown leadership and commitment, something that, if I may say, wasn't evident when he first arrived." Henry raised an eyebrow, as if her boldness surprised him, but his expression quickly turned calculating. "Interesting," he murmured softly. "Then, it seems that it's Miss Rodriguez's influence that has transformed my son." Elena opened her mouth to respond, but John cut in, stepping forward. "No," he said firmly. "It's not just because of her. I've made progress on my own too. I've worked hard. I've learned to manage this branch." He looked his father straight in the eye, without wavering. "And we've made it work. We deserve a chance." Henry remained silent, studying him. Then, slowly, he walked over to his desk and sat down, intertwining his fingers. "Prove it then," he said in a soft but dangerous voice. "I'm going to review every number, every figure, every decision you've made. If anything is off, if I find a single error, this place will be shut down and both of you will be held responsible." John felt as if a bucket of ice water had been dumped over him. He knew his father wasn't playing games. If Henry wanted, he could find the smallest excuse to tear down everything they had built. "We'll go through it together," Elena responded calmly, stepping forward. "Every number, every decision is backed by tangible results." Henry smiled slightly, a faintly paternal expression. "Very well. Then let the review begin." The following days were a whirlwind of stress and tension. Henry took over the branch like a general overseeing his troops. He combed through documents, inspected processes, and held endless meetings with the heads of every department. The employees worked twice as hard, knowing that any mistake, any error, could cost them their jobs. John and Elena were on the brink of exhaustion. They worked late into the night, reviewing and tweaking every detail to make sure everything was flawless. But as the pressure mounted, John began to crack. His father's words, his disdainful looks, and constant criticism were affecting him more than he wanted to admit. "You won't be able to handle this, John," Henry had whispered one afternoon when they were alone in the boardroom. "She's holding your hand. Without her, you're nothing." Those words burned him, making him doubt every decision, every choice he made. He started making small mistakes, missing meetings, misinterpreting reports. The employees began to notice, and Elena, who was also exhausted, saw that John was on the verge of breaking. One night, when the office was quiet and only John's office light remained on, Elena found him hunched over his desk, his hands buried in his hair. "John," she murmured softly, approaching him. He looked up, and the desperation in his eyes surprised her. "I can't do this," he whispered, his voice breaking. "He's going to destroy everything, Elena. He always does. He finds a way to make me fail, to prove that I'm worthless. And if we fail..." He buried his face in his hands. "I can't lose this. Not now." Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "We're not going to fail, John," she said firmly. "Not this time. You're right. You've worked hard too. You've changed. It's not just my work. It's our work. And if he can't see that, then that's his problem, not yours." John looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and anger. "How can you be so sure?" Elena smiled faintly. "Because I believe in you, John. Because I've seen what you're capable of, even when you can't see it." Her words hit him like a bolt of lightning. He stared at her, feeling something ignite inside him. It wasn't hope, not even confidence. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be broken by criticism or fear. "Then let's prove him wrong," John said, his voice stronger. "I'm not giving up." Elena nodded, and for the first time in days, John felt a steady calm settle within him. Maybe Henry would try to tear them down. Maybe everything would collapse. But he wouldn't fight alone. And for some reason, that was enough. The morning began ominously. John arrived at the office early, as usual, feeling a strange calm before the storm. The employees were speaking in hushed tones, casting nervous glances in his direction. There was something in the air, a sense of anticipation and fear that made his stomach clench. Elena hadn't arrived yet, which was unusual. Since they had started working together, she was always the first to arrive, ready to face the day with her unshakable energy. But that morning, her desk was empty. Something was wrong, very wrong. When John reached his own cubicle, he found a brown envelope on his desk with his name written on it in neat handwriting. Frowning, he opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a printed report and a brief note in Henry's unmistakable script. "This is what you're really trying to save, son. Now you'll understand why you'll never be able to run anything without my help." John's heart began to pound as he read the report. It was a financial document showing a series of suspicious transactions with Elena's name linked to each one. The sums were large and the money movements were detailed, as if she had been funneling funds from the branch into personal accounts. John felt his blood turn to ice. The evidence seemed irrefutable. But it couldn't be true. It couldn't. He knew Elena. He had worked side by side with her, seen her dedication, her integrity. She would never do something like this. He took a deep breath, trying to control the rage building inside him. This was his father's doing. He was sure of it. It was the move of a man desperate to regain control, willing to destroy anyone necessary to do so. But then, how had he gotten all this information? And why now? His thoughts were interrupted when the office door burst open. Elena entered, breathing heavily, her face pale. John stood up immediately, his eyes locking onto hers. There was fear in her expression, but also determination. "John, something terrible is happening," she whispered. "I know," he responded gravely, lifting the report for her to see. "My father—" He trailed off as confusion spread across her face. She didn't know what he was talking about. "What is that?" Elena asked, frowning. John approached her and handed her the report. He watched as she read it, seeing her hands begin to tremble and her eyes widen in shock. This is a lie," she whispered, staring at the documents in horror. "I didn't do any of this. I don't even know where these figures are coming from." "I know," John said firmly. "It's my father. He's trying to take you down to destroy me. If he frames you for fraud, everything we've built will fall apart. He knows that without you, I can't handle it alone," Elena finished bitterly. John felt something break inside him at the pain on her face. Elena had endured so much, had sacrificed so much to get this far, and now Henry was trying to use her as a pawn in his twisted game. The desperation in her eyes made him want to protect her more than ever. "I won't let this ruin you," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. "No matter what my father thinks, I won't let him hurt you." But before Elena could respond, the office door opened again, and several men entered with determined steps. They wore dark suits and stern expressions. John recognized them immediately. They were internal auditors, sent directly from headquarters. "Mr. Edwards," said the leader of the group, an older man with thick-rimmed glasses and an impassive expression, "we've received reports of financial irregularities at this branch. We're here to conduct an immediate audit." Elena took a step back, as if she had been physically struck. John stepped forward, his face hardened with rage. "This is absurd," John spat out, stepping forward aggressively. "You have no right to do this without concrete evidence." The lead auditor raised a folder filled with documents. "Here's the evidence, Mr. Edwards. Irregular transactions, fund misappropriations, and all of them are linked to Miss Rodriguez. I'm sorry to inform you that if these irregularities turn out to be true, this branch will be shut down immediately and Miss Rodriguez will face legal charges." John felt the fury rising inside him like a wave of fire. He looked at the documents, knowing his father was behind all of it, but he couldn't prove it. He had no concrete evidence, and in the meantime, Elena was the one who would pay the price. "You have no idea what you're doing," he growled, stepping dangerously close to the auditor. "This is a trap, just a desperate attempt by my father to destroy us." The auditor didn't flinch. His eyes moved slowly toward Elena, who stood behind John, her head bowed and shoulders tense. "I'm sorry, Mr. Edwards, but until proven otherwise, these documents speak for themselves. Miss Rodriguez, you need to come with us to answer a few questions." Elena lifted her head, and John saw the tears glistening in her eyes. But there was also a spark of pride in them. She wouldn't break. She wouldn't give Henry the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "That's fine," she said firmly, stepping forward toward the auditor. "I have nothing to hide. But you should know that this is a mistake. I didn't do anything they're accusing me of." The auditor nodded slightly. "That will be determined during the investigation." John felt something inside him shatter as he watched her walk away with the auditors. It was as if he were losing something invaluable, something he couldn't reclaim if he let her go without a fight. But what could he do? Henry held all the power. He was just a pawn in his game. As the auditors left, he was left alone in the office, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on him like a crushing weight. He looked at the report again and again, his vision blurring with fury and despair. If he didn't find a way to undo this, Elena would be destroyed, and everything they had built together would collapse. Then, an idea began to form in his mind. It was dangerous, reckless, and probably insane. But he had no other option. "If my father wants to play dirty," he muttered, gripping the report so hard that the edges crumpled, "then I will too." He jumped up and stormed out of the office, his heart racing a mile a minute. He would go to the headquarters. He would speak to the board. He would show them the truth, even if it meant facing Henry directly. Because he wasn't going to lose her. He wasn't going to lose Elena without fighting to his last breath. The headquarters of Edwards Corp was an imposing skyscraper of glass and steel in the heart of the city. Its silhouette dominated the skyline, casting a long and heavy shadow over the streets below. John had never felt as intimidated by that building as he did at that moment, walking resolutely toward the main entrance. Every muscle in his body was tense, each step filled with a desperate resolve. The vast and luxurious lobby was bustling with employees and executives moving swiftly, busy with their daily tasks. As John passed by them, some looked at him in surprise. It was rare to see him there, especially with the expression of pure determination etched on his face. Without stopping, he headed for the elevators that led to the boardroom offices. He knew his father had probably already set things in motion to discredit him. But he didn't care. He had spent too long running, doubting himself. Now, he had something to fight for. Someone to fight for. The seconds in the elevator felt eternal. The mechanical sound of the doors sliding shut mingled with the frantic beating of his heart. When the doors finally opened, John found himself standing in front of the large boardroom, with its massive mahogany doors closed and security guards stationed on either side. "Mr. Edwards, you're not allowed in," one of the guards said, stepping forward. "Allowed?" John stopped and looked at him intensely. "I'm John Edwards, and I have every right to be here." The guards exchanged uncomfortable glances, but just then, the door opened and the board's personal assistant appeared. He was a short, thin man with glasses and a stern expression. "Let him through," the assistant ordered, casting John a warning look. "But Mr. Edwards, I suggest you keep your composure." John ignored the warning and stepped inside. The large boardroom was lit by the cool lights of fluorescent bulbs. The long oak table, polished and gleaming, was surrounded by imposing figures, the board members, all in dark suits with serious expressions. At the center of the table, sitting with a relaxed posture and a faint smile on his lips, was his father, Henry Edwards. "John," Henry said softly, leaning forward slightly, "I wondered when you'd show up." John's anger flared at the sight of the satisfied expression on his father's face. This man had manipulated everything, had framed Elena, and now pretended to look at him with condescension, as if it were all just a game. "I'm here to clear Elena's name and prove that all of this is a farce," he said firmly, addressing not just Henry, but the entire board. "My father has manipulated the numbers and created a false case against her just to destroy our work at the branch." One of the board members, an older man with carefully combed grey hair, leaned forward with skepticism. "That's a very serious accusation, John." His eyes narrowed. "Do you have proof?" John felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He didn't have solid proof that Henry had orchestrated everything, but he had something even more powerful: the truth and his determination. "The proof is in the results," he said forcefully. "Look at the branch's financial reports before I arrived and compare them to the current ones. Elena and I have worked tirelessly to improve every aspect of that office. The numbers have improved, employee morale has risen, and productivity has increased by 30%. You can't ignore that just because my father is trying to discredit us." Henry let out a soft laugh, shaking his head with a mocking expression. Son," he said in a paternalistic tone, "you're naive. Good financial results don't cover up a fraud. Do you really think a few good numbers are going to erase the fact that funds were misappropriated?" John glared at him, fury simmering beneath the surface. He had expected this kind of reaction, but he wasn't backing down. "No funds were misappropriated," he replied firmly. "My father created those fake documents. He wanted this to look like a fraud to discredit me, to prove that I couldn't handle the branch. But this isn't just about me. He's attacking an innocent person." He turned to the board members, raising his voice. "If you let this happen, you're not just destroying my reputation, you're destroying the reputation of a woman who has worked harder than anyone else here. And you're killing the morale of every employee who has put their trust in us." A murmur ran through the room. The board members exchanged glances, some surprised, others thoughtful. Henry's eyes narrowed, the smile disappearing from his face. "John," he said in an icy tone, "enough of this spectacle. Go back to the branch and let the adults handle this." But John didn't back down. He turned to the board with a defiant spark in his eyes. "If you don't believe me, then fire me. But don't destroy Elena. She doesn't deserve this. If you need proof, talk to the employees. See the changes she implemented. Talk to them. You'll see that everyone trusts her." He took a deep breath and looked at his father with a hardness he had never felt before. "But if you destroy her based on these lies, you'll be making a huge mistake. And I won't stay silent." The murmurs grew louder. Henry tried to interject, but one of the board members raised a hand. "We want to hear more," he said firmly. "What do you suggest, John?" John swallowed, knowing this was his only chance. "I suggest a thorough review of the entire process at the branch. Speak to every employee, review every change we made. If you find something suspicious, then face me, not her. But if you find nothing, I want all accusations against Elena dropped, and I want her to receive the recognition she deserves." There was a long silence. Henry stood up slowly, looking at the board with cold eyes. "This is ridiculous," he growled. "We can't waste time on—" "No, Henry," interrupted the board member who had spoken earlier, his voice firm. "Your son is right. We can't make decisions based on documents alone. We need to investigate further. There will be a full review, and until then, no final decisions will be made." John felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew the battle was far from over. Henry looked at him with pure hatred, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're making a mistake, son," he whispered, his voice low enough for only John to hear. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. John stared back at him, unflinching. Then I'll fight, Father, because this time I won't let you destroy someone who matters to me. Henry fell silent, his eyes blazing with rage, but John didn't back down. He had made his decision. He would defend Elena. He would defend everything they had built, no matter the cost, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for someone else, and that gave him a strength not even Henry Edwards could break. The days following the confrontation in the boardroom were tense and filled with uncertainty. The internal audit was conducted with almost surgical precision. Every department was reviewed, every transaction scrutinized. The branch employees were interviewed, and each one shared their experiences, talking about the changes Elena and John had implemented. The conversations were long and detailed, but one truth slowly began to emerge. There was no fraud. There was no embezzlement. There was only a group of people fighting to save their workplace. John spent those days in a state of limbo, watching from a distance as the auditors did their job. He wasn't allowed to interfere, and that helplessness nearly drove him mad. But as time went by, he began to hear whispers in the corridors of the central office, comments that brought with them a glimmer of hope. It seems they didn't find anything suspicious in the accounts. The employees fully support Elena Rodriguez. They say she's the one who brought improvements to the branch. Henry Edwards is furious. I think he's losing control this time. John clung to those comments, trying not to let hope turn into anxiety. Finally, after almost a week of reviews and interviews, the board called for an extraordinary meeting. The atmosphere in the large boardroom was dense and heavy when John walked in. Elena was by his side, her head held high and her eyes fixed on the board members. Despite everything that had happened, her dignity remained intact. Henry was there too, standing at the head of the table, his expression one of barely contained rage. The other board members watched him closely, their faces impassive but with flashes of distrust in their eyes. "Mr. Edwards," one of the auditors said firmly, "after an exhaustive review, we found no evidence of any irregularities in the branch's finances. Everything is in order, and the improvements implemented have been beneficial for both productivity and the team's morale." John felt a wave of relief wash over him, but Henry didn't move. He stood still, his jaw clenched. "That's impossible," he growled, his eyes fixed on the auditor. "Check again. I'm sure there were diversions. That woman," he said, gesturing towards Elena with disdain, "must be hiding something." Elena remained calm, looking at him coldly. "I've done nothing wrong, Mr. Edwards. Every change we implemented was to improve the branch's safety and efficiency. The employees themselves can attest to that." Henry let out a cold laugh, looking at the board members as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Are you going to let yourselves be fooled by a few sweet words?" he asked, his tone dripping with contempt. "This place is filled with lies. It's a game my son and this woman have orchestrated to make me look incompetent." Murmurs rose around the table. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. John stepped forward, raising his voice with a firmness that surprised even himself. "This isn't a game, Father," he said strongly. "I've worked hard. I've changed. And not because you demanded it, but because I finally understood that I wanted to be a better person. Someone who could earn people's respect, not impose it through power. Elena taught me that." The words fell into the room like a stone in a pond, creating ripples of shock. Henry's eyes narrowed, his lips twisting into a sneer. "She taught you," he repeated mockingly. "Have you become so weak that now you need a mere cleaner to show you the way?" He turned to the board members, raising his voice. "This is the problem. John has always been weak. He doesn't have the strength to lead. That's why I've had to step in." "No," interrupted one of the directors, a man with white hair and a stern expression. "The problem, Henry, is that you've tried to destroy what your son was building." The employees spoke. They all agree that there's been a real change in that branch. John and Miss Rodriguez have achieved what you couldn't. They inspired people. And if you can't see that, it's because you don't want to face the truth." Henry stood motionless, fury burning in his eyes. But before he could respond, another voice rose in the room. "If I may add something." It was Mr. Coleman, the branch manager, who had been called in as a witness. He stepped forward and looked directly at Henry with a firmness no one had ever seen in him before. "I supervised John since he arrived. At first he was a mess, yes, but he didn't quit. He didn't give up. He listened, he learned, and finally, he led. If that branch is still open, it's because of him and Miss Rodriguez. They transformed the place." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Henry seemed to falter, as if the ground were crumbling beneath his feet. He turned to John, his gaze filled with pure hatred. "So now you think you can challenge me," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "Do you think you can surpass me, humiliate me?" John took a deep breath. He was trembling inside, but he forced himself to stand firm. "This isn't about surpassing you, Father," he said calmly. "It's about doing the right thing. All you've done is try to destroy me, to manipulate me so I would fail, and you could prove I'm not capable. But this time, you won't succeed. This time, I have the truth on my side." Henry fell silent. The board members exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events. "Henry," the lead director said heavily, "we've made our decision. We will drop all charges against Miss Rodriguez and acknowledge John's work. But we also believe that you have lost perspective. We cannot allow your personal animosity to interfere with the business any longer." Henry paled. John watched in astonishment as his father, the invincible Henry Edwards, the business titan, began to lose control. The board members nodded one by one. "We have decided," the director continued, "that effective immediately, you will be temporarily removed from your executive duties until a full review of your recent actions is completed. John, meanwhile, will take over as the interim director of the branch and will decide how to proceed." John felt as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He looked at Henry, expecting an explosion of rage. But instead, his father stood still, watching him with a glacial intensity. "So, that's it?" Henry whispered. "You'd rather be a traitor than a failure." "I'm not a traitor," John replied firmly. "I'm just someone who's finally making his own decisions." The silence that followed was deathly still. Henry looked at the others, his expression eerily calm. "You're making a big mistake," he muttered, but his voice lacked strength. "A mistake you'll regret." The security guards approached, and surprisingly, he didn't resist. He walked out of the room with his head held high, but John knew that defeat had wounded him deeply. When the door closed, all eyes turned to him. John felt small under their stares, but also strangely free. "Well done, John," the director said with a slight smile. "You've shown more courage than many thought you had." John nodded slowly, barely grasping what had just happened. He turned to Elena, who looked at him with a mixture of relief and admiration. "You did it," she whispered with a trembling smile. "You made it." John shook his head. "We made it. I couldn't have done it without you." Elena smiled back at him, and at that moment, John knew that no matter what happened from now on, he would never be the same again. The office had an air of renewal as John and Elena crossed the entrance the next day. The atmosphere was different, lighter, filled with a kind of positive energy that hadn't been felt there in months. The employees, seeing them enter, paused for a moment and began to applaud, their faces lit up with genuine smiles. John felt overwhelmed. He looked at Elena, who smiled shyly beside him, and he knew that everything they had done had been worth it. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a shared victory for every person who had fought alongside them. And even though he was now temporarily in charge of the branch, he knew he hadn't reached that position alone. When the applause finally died down, Mr. Coleman stepped forward, his eyes shining with emotion. "I want to take a moment to congratulate both of you," he said, addressing both John and Elena. "Not just for saving the branch, but for showing us all that the true strength of a leader doesn't lie in his power, but in his ability to inspire others." John nodded, moved by his words. It was hard to imagine that just a few months ago he had been just an irresponsible young man with no purpose. But here he was, having overcome trials he never thought he could face. "Thank you, Mr. Coleman," he said firmly, "but I didn't do it alone. If it hadn't been for Elena, I would have never made it this far." Elena looked at him in surprise, her eyes glistening with an emotion she quickly tried to hide. "John, you don't owe me anything. You're the one who chose to change." John shook his head, not taking his eyes off her. "No, you're the one who showed me that I could change." He took a deep breath and turned to everyone present. "Starting today, this branch will no longer be seen as the forgotten branch. We're going to continue with the reforms, and I want each one of you to know that you have a place here, that your voice will be heard. This is not just my victory, it's our victory." A murmur of approval spread through the room. The employees looked at him with respect, and John felt a wave of warmth inside. He had never experienced something like this before, the genuine respect of people for his efforts, not for his last name. The following days were filled with intense work and planning. With the branch now safe and all charges officially dropped against Elena, John and she focused on strengthening each department, implementing new policies, and ensuring that the trust they had built didn't crumble. The employees became even more united, and the results began to show in the numbers. Profits stabilized, and the branch, once on the brink of closure, now stood as one of the most promising. But not all the changes were reflected in the numbers or in production. John also realized something deeper, something that had silently grown between them. Every day he spent with Elena, every decision they made together, strengthened their connection. He saw it in the way she looked at him when they discussed new ideas, in the way she smiled when they managed to solve a complex problem, and in how her mere presence made everything seem possible. One day, while reviewing a new expansion plan in his office, John paused and watched her. Elena was focused, her gaze fixed on the documents, and her hair softly falling over her face. John felt a wave of emotion that he couldn't ignore. "Elena," he murmured, catching her attention. She looked up, her expression curious. "Yes?" John took a deep breath, feeling his heart pounding. He knew this was the moment. He could no longer hide what he felt. "I want you to stay here," he said, his words loaded with meaning. "But not as a supervisor, not even as my colleague." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "I want you to stay with me." Elena blinked, clearly surprised. "John, I'm not just talking about work," he interrupted softly. "What we've done here is incredible. But more than that, you've shown me who I can be. You've helped me become a better person. And I don't want to move forward without you by my side." Elena remained silent, her gaze searching his face, as if trying to ensure he meant it. John felt panic lurking in the back of his mind, but he didn't back down. He had come too far to turn back now. "I know I haven't been the best person," he continued, his voice trembling a little. "But I want to be someone worthy of you, someone you can build something real with, not just at work, but in life." Elena looked at him, her eyes shining with a mix of surprise and emotion. "John, I never thought you'd say something like that. I don't want to leave either. But this..." Her voice broke for a moment, and she took a deep breath to steady herself. "I'm scared. And if things don't work out..." John shook his head, closing the distance between them. "They will," he whispered with absolute conviction. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm sure of what I want. And I want you. I want you and everything we've built together." Elena blinked, tears filling her eyes. John felt the world come to a standstill as he waited for her answer, his heart beating so hard he feared she could hear it. Finally, Elena smiled, a timid smile filled with hope. Then, "Yes," she whispered. "I want to stay with you, John. No matter what happens, I want to be by your side." The joy that burst inside him was so intense that John could hardly breathe. With a laugh of pure happiness, he took a step forward and embraced her, feeling her body relax in his arms. Elena clung to him, and for a moment, everything else vanished. The challenges, the difficulties, even the weight of the family legacy. It all disappeared. It was just the two of them. When they finally pulled away, John gently took her hand. "Then let's build something together," he said softly. "Not just at the company, everywhere." Elena nodded, her eyes filled with tears and a radiant smile. "Together," she repeated softly, "until the end." And as they stood there, in the small office that had once been a symbol of failure for John, it was now a place of hope and promise, a new beginning. The past of arrogance, irresponsibility, and rivalry faded away, replaced by something purer and more genuine. The man who had entered that office months ago no longer existed. In his place stood someone who finally understood what it meant to fight for something greater than oneself. And as John and Elena looked toward the future, they knew that, together, no obstacle would be insurmountable. The office was silent. The soft evening light filtered through the windows, casting a gentle golden hue over everything. John was alone in his office, leaning against the window frame, staring at the horizon. The city stretched out before him, its constant bustle and relentless activity the same as always. But he was lost in his thoughts, reflecting on everything that had happened in the past few months. It was strange to think about how it had all started. That morning, when he had woken up hungover from a party and was dragged into his father's office. Henry, with his stern gaze and voice filled with disdain, had given him an ultimatum: marry a cleaner to learn humility and responsibility. He had thought it was the end of his life as he knew it. And, in a way, it was. John looked at his hands, the same hands that had barely touched a file or signed a check before, now showing small marks of real effort. The man who had started that path full of resentment and rebellion was far from the one now looking at his reflection in the window glass. "Funny, isn't it?" he murmured quietly, as if speaking to the shadow of his former self. "All this started as a punishment, a way to humiliate me. But it ended up giving me something I never thought I needed." If someone had told the John of the past that he would fall in love with the very woman he had seen as a tool for his redemption, he would have laughed in their face. But Elena had shown him what it meant to fight for something real, to build from scratch and cherish every small step forward. He remembered the rage with which he had tried to sabotage his own work, his disdain for every employee, his contempt for Elena. She, with her unshakable patience, had endured it all. And instead of crumbling under his venom, she had faced him with a dignity he hadn't understood back then. But now, he did. It was that dignity, that inner strength, that had transformed him. He smiled to himself. Who would have thought that his father's punishment would become the greatest lesson of his life? Henry had sent him there to crush him, to force him to bend or break in the process. But he had overlooked one crucial thing. He had underestimated Elena. "You forced me to marry a cleaner to punish me," he said aloud, as if speaking directly to his father. "But it was she who taught me what true strength is. It wasn't your plan. It wasn't your manipulation. It was her." Elena had been the key to opening his eyes to reality. He had learned more about hard work, respect, and responsibility in those months with her than in his entire life of luxury and indulgence. Henry, unknowingly, had put in his path the only person capable of challenging his ego, forcing him to grow, and teaching him the true meaning of strength. He had tried to humiliate him, but instead, he had set him free. John smiled sadly. Henry, with all his power and control, had failed in his primary goal. He had wanted John to become a reflection of himself, a ruthless and merciless leader. But in his attempt to destroy him, he had created someone entirely different. A man who valued people not for what they had, but for who they were. A soft knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. "John?" Elena's voice, soft and warm, filled him with peace. "Come in," he said, turning towards her. Elena entered with a gentle smile, her eyes reflecting the same calm he felt. She approached and stood beside him, gazing out at the horizon through the window. There was a moment of silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence full of understanding. "Are you okay?" she asked, resting her head gently on his shoulder. John wrapped his arm around her and pulled her closer. "I am," he replied sincerely. "I was just thinking about how all this started. How—" He paused, searching for the right words. "How my father tried to punish me and ended up giving me the best thing in my life." Elena looked at him curiously, raising an eyebrow. "Are you saying your father's madness was a good thing?" John let out a soft laugh. "Yes, because if none of this had happened, I would never have truly known you, and I would never have learned what it really means to be strong." His voice softened as he looked into her eyes. "I thought success was measured by power and money, but you taught me that true success is being able to stand up, even when everything is against you. It's fighting for what's right, even when you could take the easy way out." Elena smiled, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "You were never weak, John. You just needed to find something worth fighting for." John nodded slowly. She was right. He had spent his whole life trying to meet others' expectations, seeking his father's approval, chasing dreams that weren't his own. But now, all that had changed. Now, he had something real, something he had chosen for himself. "And you gave me that," he said softly. "You gave me the strength to find my own path." Elena looked at him with a tenderness that almost disarmed him. "You gave me something too, John. You gave me hope when I had already lost it." John leaned in and gently touched his forehead to hers, feeling the warmth of her presence. "So, I guess we owe my father a strange thank you, don't we?" he joked softly. Elena laughed and shook her head. "No, we don't owe your father anything. We owe it all to ourselves." John looked at her, and in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty. She was right. Henry had pushed them onto this path, yes, but every step they had taken since then, every decision that had brought them here, had been theirs. It wasn't the result of a master plan or a well-thought-out punishment. It was the result of two people who had found each other, fought, and grown together. "You're right," he murmured with a calm smile. "All of this, we built it ourselves, and now we have a future worth fighting for." Elena looked at him with bright eyes, full of promise. "Together, John. Always together." John embraced her, letting the moment envelop him. Yes, his father had tried to destroy him, but in doing so, he had set him free. And now, for the first time, he was ready to forge his own path. A path of his own choosing. A path with Elena by his side. With a final sigh of peace, John looked toward the future with determination. Together, and the best is yet to come. And that's all for today. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss a single video. See you in the next video.